Hi, I'm Matthew Nomchik, and my presentation is on the Cold War. The Cold War was essentially a geopolitical state of tension following World War II between the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States and its NATO allies. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution started with the February Revolution, in which the Tsarist government was overthrown and a provisional government was put into place. What followed was the October Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks, a group of working-class Russian citizens, led by Vladimir Lenin, took over the Russian government. Vladimir Lenin was heavily influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, and by 1922, the Soviet Union was founded with the principles of communism in mind. In establishing the Soviet Union, they also established the Communist International, a document which called for world communism and advocated revolutions abroad. The second part of the origins of the Cold War can be traced to the US and USSR alliance during World War II. The USSR had been betrayed by Germany in World War II and had joined the Allies. But with the differing goals that they had and the anger at the German government for their attack on them, there were many differences that they had following the war. As stated, there were a lot of differences in what should be done following the war between the US and the other allies and the Soviet Union. A lot of these differences didn't really come up until the conferences following the war, but they had a very different viewpoint as to what borders should be drawn, what kind of security should be put in place, and what kind of reparations the German government should pay. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin sought control over the affairs of all the countries that bordered the Soviet Union. They laid the foundation for this during World War II when they invaded and annexed several countries surrounding the Soviet Union and called it the Soviet Socialist Republics. This laid the foundation for the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union and created a massive rift between the Soviet Union and its former allies of World War II. Tensions increased further with the release of two telegrams. The first, known as the Long Telegram, outlined the U.S.'s stance against the Soviets and served as the basis for the U.S. strategy against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The second was known as the Novikov Telegram and was sent by a Soviet ambassador to the U.S. and outlined how the U.S. was a monopoly capitalist government that were just building up their military in a vie for world supremacy. Another thing that increased tensions was the Iron Curtain speech that Winston Churchill delivered in the United States. In this speech, he accused the Soviet Union of establishing an Iron Curtain from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Joseph Stalin did not take well and called the speech a call for war on the USSR. The disagreements between the US and the USSR increasingly became a contest between capitalism and communism. What followed was the US government's adoption of the policy of containment and the Truman Doctrine, which was to aid them in that policy. The first example of this was when the British government announced that it couldn't finance the Greek civil war against the communist revolutionaries. The Truman Doctrine called for the allocation of $400 million, and it framed the conflict between the government and the insurgents as a contest between free people and a totalitarian regime. The Cold War started in earnest with the enaction of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a pledge of $13 billion of economic assistance to any European country willing to participate. The goal of the plan was to rebuild the democratic and economic systems that were destroyed by the war, and shift the balance of power that the Soviet Union and the communist revolutionaries were trying to seize across Europe. Joseph Stalin did not take well to this plan and believed that the economic integration that was received as a result of the United States aid would allow Eastern Bloc countries to escape from Soviet control, and he responded by launching a coup in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia at this time was the only Eastern Bloc state that the Soviets had allowed to retain their democratic system. This launched into motion the Cold War because the Greek military ended up winning their civil war and Czechoslovakia fell completely to the Soviets. Another response to the Marshall Plan was the Soviet Union adopting the Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade, which lasted nearly a year, was a response to the Marshall Plan and its goal of reindustrializing and rebuilding the German economy. The Soviet Union was upset about this because they wanted Germany to suffer more from their betrayal of the Soviet Union. This started the United States, Britain, France, Canada, Australia, and other countries launching the Berlin Airlift, which provided West Berlin with food and several other provisions. With the Soviet Union annexing countries in Europe, many European countries became defensive. An example of this was the Treaty of Brussels being signed between Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and the United Kingdom. This treaty led to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. NATO included those countries that were previously mentioned, as well as the United States, Canada, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. The stated goal, in the words of the NATO's first Secretary General, was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. At this point, actions taken by both sides rapidly accelerated the conflict. In 1949, Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army defeated the United States-backed government in China. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union quickly announced an alliance between Mao Zedong and the People's Republic of China. As a direct result of the United States' policy of containment, the Korean War happened. In 1950, Kim Il-sung's North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea. Stalin played a major role in this as he sent advisors from the Soviet Union to help the North Koreans plan their invasion. To his surprise, the United States and the UN Security Council backed the defense of South Korea. This led to a major conflict and a pseudo-war in which the United States backed the South Koreans and the Soviets backed the North Koreans. With conflict continuing to escalate, the United States and the Soviet Union both pursued nuclear rearmament and developed long-range weapons to attack each other. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1, which started the space race. The space race lasted several years and culminated with the United States landing on the moon with the Apollo missions. In 1959, Cuba launched a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. In order to cement his place in the Caribbean, with the United States right next door, he entered a series of agreements with the Soviet government. What this led to was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which saw Kennedy trying to overthrow the Cuban government, and the Soviet Union placing missiles on Cuba, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted nearly a year, saw the world come closer to a nuclear war than it ever had before. Following this, the Vietnam War started. The Vietnam War was another proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Although, due to mounting pressures from the domestic front, such as anti-war efforts, and the United States' lack of ability to successfully attack Vietnam bases without possibly killing Soviet agents, they lost the war. What followed the Vietnam War in the 1970s was détente, which was a mutual interest in peace talks to allow for a more stable and predictable international system between the two governments. This didn't last long, however, as various geopolitical interests of the countries got in the way of a permanent peace. As stated, détente did not last long, and in 1978 the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power. What followed was a civil war between them and the guerrilla Mujahideen forces. The Soviet Union directly involved themselves in this conflict by sending thousands of military advisors. This action was looked down upon by the United States and its allies, and caused the U.S. to boycott the Summer Olympics in Moscow and impose embargoes on exports from the USSR. 1983 was the year the world came the closest it's ever been to all-out nuclear war. This started as a result from a false alarm from a Soviet early missile warning system. A lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Union named Stanislav Petrov, who was the only one on duty during the incident, saw that an intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the United States. He dismissed this as a computer error, as only one missile was launched, and he reasoned that if it was a true attack, there would be thousands of simultaneous launches from the United States. A second close call happened as a result of Able Archer 83. This was a war scenario in which NATO simulated a nuclear attack. It involved the United States moving from DEFCON 5 all the way to DEFCON 1, and while this was simulated, KGB agents mistook these simulations as an actual attack. Thankfully, neither side responded with nuclear action, and perhaps seeing how close the world came to nuclear annihilation, relations began to thaw. What followed this was the German reunification and the Berlin reunification with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. Following that was the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty signed between Mikhail Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush at the Malta Summit. There they declared the end of the Cold War, but the Cold War can be officially seen as ending with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which occurred in 1992. The Cold War marked an important period in which the two global superpowers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, vied for power. It set the stage for many global governments and policies, and its impact can surely be seen today.